When my husband told me I was nothing but a placeholder in his life, I smiled and said I understood. Days later, I was standing over his hospital bed as he battled pneumonia, holding his power of attorney in my purse. That's when I realized life isn't about the cards you're dealt, but how strategically you play your hand. If you're watching this unfold, subscribe now and tell me if you've ever had to teach someone a lesson they'll never forget. Trust me, this story is just getting started, and you'll want to be here for every delicious moment of justice. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who would fake her own death. But then again, I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who would spend 15 years with a man who treated our marriage vows like suggestions rather than promises. My name is Eleanor Blackwood, and for nearly 2 decades, I built an empire alongside my husband, Richard, a self-made real estate mogul with the charm of a politician and the moral compass of a weather vane. The first time I found another woman's lipstick on his collar, I was 29. We'd been married for just 3 years. He called it a mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment fueled by too much champagne at a business function. I believed him because I wanted to, because I'd already invested my heart, my dreams, and my inheritance into our shared future. "Eleanor, sweetheart," he'd said, his voice dripping with practiced remorse, "you're the only woman I truly love. The rest, they're nothing. Distractions." By the 5th affair, I'd stopped confronting him. By the 10th, I'd stopped counting. Instead, I poured myself into building our business, transforming his modest real estate company into Blackwood Properties, a name that commanded respect in 3 states. While Richard charmed investors and cut ribbons, I managed the books, negotiated with contractors, and quietly acquired properties under my own name, a safety net I hoped I'd never need to use. Then Veronica Pierce sauntered into our lives. She was 26 to my 44, with razor-sharp cheekbones and ambition that matched her 5-inch stilettos. Richard hired her as his executive assistant despite her conspicuous lack of qualifications. I watched them from my office window, the way he leaned too close when they looked at property plans, the way she laughed at his jokes with her head thrown back, exposing the slender column of her throat. "She's very efficient," Richard said when I casually inquired about the new hire. "Exactly what the company needs right now." What the company needed, apparently, was someone who stayed late every night, who accompanied my husband on weekend business trips, and who began wearing jewelry that I knew cost more than her monthly salary. I might have continued our charade indefinitely if not for what I overheard at our anniversary party. 15 years of marriage, crystal, according to tradition. Richard had spared no expense, inviting 200 of Boston's elite to our waterfront home. I'd spent the evening playing the perfect hostess, my face aching from smiling, when I stepped into Richard's study to retrieve more champagne from his private reserve. The door to the balcony was ajar, and through it, I heard Veronica's distinctive laugh. 15 years with the Ice Queen," Richard said, his words slightly slurred. "Do you know what she said when I told her I was taking you to Paris next month? That she hoped we'd have a productive business trip." Poor Eleanor, Veronica purred, and I could hear the mockery in her voice. "She really has no idea, does she?"
None.
"And she never will. She's too invested in the Blackwood name, in maintaining appearances. She'd rather ignore what's right in front of her than admit her marriage is a sham." I stood frozen, the champagne forgotten. In 15 years, Richard had never spoken to me with such contempt. "And the best part," he continued, "she thinks she's so clever with her secret accounts and property acquisitions. As if I wouldn't notice my own wife siphoning money from our company." My blood turned to ice. How long had he known?
"What will you do about it?"
Veronica asked. "Nothing for now. Let her think she's outsmarting me. When the time is right, I'll make sure she walks away with exactly what she deserves, nothing. And us." There was a hungry edge to Veronica's question. "Once Eleanor is out of the picture, everything will be ours. The company, the properties, the lifestyle, all of it. You just need to be patient a little longer, darling." The glass in my hand slipped, shattering on the hardwood floor. Outside, the conversation abruptly stopped. I didn't wait to be discovered. I slipped out through the servants' entrance, locked myself in our guest suite, and stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The woman who stared back at me looked exactly as Richard had described, an ice queen. Composed, dignified, and utterly alone. But behind that frozen exterior, something was cracking, melting, transforming into a rage so pure it scared me. That night, as guests danced and laughed below, I made my decision. If Richard wanted me out of the picture, I would oblige him, but on my terms. And when I returned, I would take back everything that was rightfully mine, including my dignity. The plan came together with surprising ease. As the wife of a prominent businessman, I had connections throughout Boston, including with James Sullivan, Richard's oldest friend and our family attorney. James had drafted our wills, our business contracts, and, ironically, the prenuptial agreement that Richard believed would leave me destitute in the event of a divorce. What Richard didn't know was that James had harbored feelings for me since college. We'd dated briefly before I met Richard, and though James had gracefully stepped aside, the torch he carried was visible in his eyes whenever Richard wasn't looking. More importantly, James had witnessed enough of Richard's indiscretions over the years to have developed a simmering resentment toward his old friend. "You want to do what?" James asked when I explained my plan over lunch at a discreet restaurant in Cambridge, far from our usual haunts. "I want to die," I said calmly, stirring my tea. "Temporarily, of course." James adjusted his glasses, a nervous habit from our college days. "Eleanor, if this is about Richard's indiscretions, there are more conventional approaches. Divorce would leave me with far less than I've earned." I interrupted. "You and I both know that prenup is airtight. Richard would drag the proceedings out for years, hiding assets, pleading poverty. By the time it was over, I'd be lucky to walk away with my clothes. But faking your death? It's extreme. Not to mention potentially illegal." I leaned forward. "Not if we're careful. I'm not talking about insurance fraud or anything that would trigger an investigation. Just a quiet disappearance, a presumption of death, and then, when the time is right, a miraculous return. And what exactly would this accomplish that a good divorce attorney couldn't? It would show me who's loyal and who isn't. It would give me time to secure certain assets without Richard breathing down my neck. And most importantly," I smiled, though it didn't reach my eyes, "it would give Richard and his mistress enough rope to hang themselves." James was silent for a long moment, swirling the ice in his water glass. Finally, he sighed. "What do you need from me? Make it official enough to be believable, but vague enough to be deniable. I need to disappear for a while, 3 months, maybe 4. Long enough for Richard to believe I'm gone for good, but not so long that the business suffers. And the cause of death? Something clean. Boating accident, perhaps? My body lost at sea. Tragic, but not suspicious." James looked troubled. "Eleanor, have you considered what this will do to the people who genuinely care about you? Your sister, your nieces?" I had considered it, and the guilt weighed heavily. But my sister Olivia knew Richard better than most. She'd warned me about his wandering eye before I'd even walked down the aisle. She would understand, eventually. "I'll find a way to let them know the truth," I promised. "But only those I can trust absolutely." 2 weeks later, I disappeared. A rented yacht, a carefully timed storm, a distress call cut ominously short. The Coast Guard searched for 3 days before declaring it a recovery mission rather than a rescue. By day 5, news outlets were reporting the presumed death of Eleanor Blackwood, wife of prominent businessman Richard Blackwood, lost at sea during a solo sailing trip. In reality, I was safely ensconced in a modest cabin in the Berkshires, one of the properties I'd purchased under my maiden name. I'd withdrawn a significant amount of cash in the weeks leading up to my death. Not enough to raise suspicions, but enough to live comfortably while I watched my plan unfold from afar. James kept me updated. Richard, he reported, had played the grieving widower convincingly for the cameras. He even managed to squeeze out a tear during the press conference, James said during one of our encrypted calls. But he was back at the office the next day, with Veronica shadowing his every move. "And the memorial service?" I asked. Richard had insisted on a service despite the absence of a body, a public display of mourning that made me sick to my stomach. set for next Friday. He's sparing no expense. Half of Boston's elite has RSVP'd. Good, I said. I'll be there. Eleanor, that's insane. Someone will recognize you. Not if I'm careful. I need to see it, James. I need to see their faces when they think I'm gone for good. It was a risk, but a calculated one. I spent the next week transforming myself. I dyed my signature auburn hair a nondescript brown, invested in colored contacts to change my green eyes to hazel, and practiced walking with a slight limp to alter my normally straight-backed gait. On the day of the memorial, I arrived as Catherine Mills, a distant cousin from Richard's mother's side, a branch of the family tree obscure enough that no one would question my unfamiliar face. The service was exactly as I'd imagined, lavish, well-attended, and dripping with insincerity. Richard stood at the front of our family church, his head bowed appropriately, his dark suit impeccably tailored. Veronica sat in the third row, not close enough to raise eyebrows, but far more prominent than an executive assistant had any right to be. I slipped into a seat near the back, keeping my veiled hat low over my face. The eulogies were predictable. Richard spoke of our partnership, carefully avoiding any mention of love or passion. Business associates praised my acumen and philanthropy. My sister Olivia, the only person whose grief seemed genuine, could barely speak through her tears. And then Veronica approached the podium. A murmur rippled through the congregation. It was inappropriate, everyone knew, for an employee to speak at such an intimate gathering. But Richard nodded encouragingly, and Veronica took her place behind the microphone. Eleanor Blackwood was. She paused, as if searching for the right words. A formidable woman. Someone who commanded respect in a male-dominated industry. As Mr. Blackwood's assistant, I saw firsthand the impact she had on Blackwood Properties. Standard platitudes, nothing unexpected. But then her tone shifted, just slightly. Eleanor was also a woman who knew the importance of appearances, of maintaining a certain facade. Her eyes flickered to Richard, a private communication passing between them. She built walls around herself, never letting anyone truly see the real Eleanor. Perhaps that's why she chose to be alone on that boat in those final moments. The implication that I had been somehow responsible for my own isolation, my own death, hung in the air like poison. I dug my nails into my palms, fighting to maintain my composure. But life moves forward, Veronica continued, her voice strengthening. And though Eleanor is gone, her legacy will continue through the company she helped build. A company that will now enter a new era of growth and innovation. She might as well have planted a flag on my grave. I watched as she returned to her seat, as Richard squeezed her hand briefly, a gesture small enough to be dismissed as collegial comfort, but which I recognized as the intimate acknowledgement it was. The reception afterward was held at our home, my home, and I forced myself to attend, to circulate on the periphery, watching as Veronica played hostess, directing caterers and greeting guests as if she already owned the place. Which I supposed she believed she soon would. Such a tragedy. A woman I didn't recognize murmured to her companion as I passed. But between us, that marriage was dead long before she was. Richard certainly seems to be finding comfort quickly, her friend replied with a knowing smirk. Have you seen the way he looks at that assistant of his? I give it 6 months before she's wearing Eleanor's jewelry. I slipped away, finding a quiet corner of the garden where I could breathe. The sun was setting over the harbor, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. This house, which I had decorated room by room, which had been my sanctuary despite the hollowness of my marriage, already felt like it belonged to someone else. Catherine Mills. I turned, startled, to find James approaching. We'd agreed to maintain minimal contact during the service, but his expression was urgent. Is everything all right? I asked, careful to disguise my voice with the slight southern accent I'd practiced. I thought you should know, he said quietly. They're discussing the will reading. It's scheduled for Thursday. So soon? The memorial reception wasn't even over, and already they were dividing the spoils. Richard insisted. Said there was no point in prolonging the inevitable. James glanced over his shoulder. There's something else. I overheard Veronica on the phone earlier. She's already contacted a real estate agent about listing this house. A cold fury settled in my chest. Then, I suppose Thursday will be quite a day for both of them. After the reception, I returned to my hideaway in the Berkshires, counting down the hours until the will reading. According to our plan, James had prepared 2 versions of my will, the public one, which would be read at the formal gathering, and the real one, which contained provisions that would only be triggered upon my actual death, verified by DNA evidence. The morning of the reading dawned clear and bright, a beautiful September day that belied the storm I was about to unleash. I dressed with care in a tailored black suit, not Catherine Mill's modest attire, but Eleanor Blackwood's armor. I styled my hair back to its natural auburn, removed the colored contacts, and stood tall, embracing the posture I'd spent a lifetime perfecting. Today, Eleanor Blackwood would rise from the dead. I arrived at James' office 10 minutes before the scheduled reading. He ushered me into a small conference room adjacent to the main meeting space, where I could hear the others already gathering. "Are you sure about this?" James asked one final time. "Once you walk through that door, there's no going back." I met his gaze steadily. I'm not the one who should be afraid of what happens next. Through the thin wall, I could hear Richard's voice, confident and controlled as always. "James, I appreciate the formality, but surely we could have handled this more efficiently." Eleanor's wishes were quite clear. "Protocol must be followed, Richard," James replied, his professional tone betraying none of our conspiracy. "As executor of Eleanor's estate, it's my responsibility to ensure everything is handled according to her explicit instructions." Of course. Richard's impatience was palpable even through the wall. "It's just that there are pressing business matters requiring my attention. The waterfront development project, specifically. My project. The one I'd spent 3 years bringing to life, negotiating with city officials, environmental agencies, and community organizations to create a development that would transform Boston's shoreline while preserving its historical character. Richard had shown minimal interest until the contracts were signed and the press coverage began. "The reading won't take long," James assured him. "I've asked everyone to be seated, so we can begin." I heard the scrape of chairs, the murmur of voices settling. My sister Olivia's quiet sniffling, a few business partners making awkward small talk. And then, cutting through it all, Veronica's voice, crisp, authoritative, and utterly out of place. "Before we start, I want to confirm that all of Eleanor's personal effects, specifically her jewelry and artwork, are included in the estate distribution. My grandmother's emerald necklace, the collection of local artists I'd supported since their first gallery showings. She wanted it all. All assets will be addressed in the reading," James said neutrally. "Now, if everyone is settled, I'll begin." He stepped out briefly, catching my eye with a nearly imperceptible nod. It was time. "Thank you all for coming today," James began, his voice carrying clearly through the open doorway. "We're here to execute the last will and testament of Eleanor Catherine Blackwood. Before I proceed with the formal reading, I want to note that Eleanor left specific instructions for how this meeting should be conducted." I could picture Richard shifting impatiently in his seat, Veronica beside him, both of them eager to claim their prize. "First, she asked that I share a personal message," James continued, unfolding a letter I had written. "To those gathered here today, if you are hearing these words, then you believe I am dead. Some of you may be grieving sincerely." A pointed pause. Others may be calculating their gain from my absence. The room fell silent. Throughout my life, I have valued truth above all else, even when that truth was painful to acknowledge. I built a business on the principle that integrity matters, that how we conduct ourselves when no one is watching defines who we truly are. I stepped forward, positioning myself just outside the doorway, heart pounding but resolve unshaken. "So before my worldly possessions are distributed, I have one final request, that each person in this room reflect honestly on how they honored, or failed to honor, their relationship with me while I lived." James looked up from the letter, his gaze traveling to where I stood. On cue, I stepped into the doorway. Because I've been doing quite a lot of reflecting myself, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. The reaction was everything I had imagined during my weeks of exile. Olivia screamed, her hands flying to her mouth. Business associates half rose from their seats, faces contorted in confusion. Richard went completely still, his normally ruddy complexion draining to ashen gray. And Veronica, perfect, polished Veronica, swayed in her seat, her crimson lips forming a perfect O of shock before her eyes rolled back and she slumped against Richard's shoulder in a dead faint. Eleanor, Richard finally managed, his voice a strangled whisper. This is your... alive? Yes, quite inconveniently for some. I stepped fully into the room, enjoying the weight of every eye upon me. I believe we were about to discuss my will. Please, James, continue. James, to his credit, maintained his professional composure. Perhaps under the circumstances, we should postpone. Nonsense. I interrupted smoothly. Everyone has taken time from their busy schedules to be here. It would be rude to send them away without resolution. I took the empty seat at the head of the table, directly opposite Richard. Although I suppose the nature of that resolution has changed somewhat. Veronica was beginning to stir, her eyelids fluttering. Richard, still frozen in shock, made no move to help her. Eleanor, Olivia choked out, tears streaming down her face. How could you? We thought. I thought. I know, Liv, I said, softening slightly. And I'm truly sorry for the pain I caused you. I'll explain everything later, I promise. Explain? Richard finally found his voice, anger replacing his initial shock. You let everyone believe you were dead. Do you have any idea what you've done? The company stock, the insurance claim. No claim was filed, James interjected smoothly. As Eleanor's body was never recovered, the standard 7-year waiting period would apply before any life insurance payout could be processed. This is insane, Richard sputtered. You've lost your mind, Eleanor. Completely lost your mind. On the contrary, I replied, icily calm. I've never seen things more clearly. Would you like to know what clarity looks like, Richard? It looks like watching your own memorial service from the back row. It looks like hearing your husband's mistress practically dancing on your grave. Veronica had regained consciousness and was now shrinking into her seat. Her earlier confidence evaporated. I don't know what you think you heard, she began. Oh, I heard plenty. I turned to address the entire room. What I find most interesting is how quickly the narrative about me changed after my death. How swiftly I went from respected businesswoman to cold, isolated figure. How conveniently my supposed emotional deficiencies explained away certain arrangements. A murmur ran through the assembled group. Richard's jaw worked silently, calculations clearly running behind his eyes. Eleanor, he finally said, his tone shifting to the conciliatory one he'd used after each discovered affair. You're upset, and understandably so. We should discuss this privately, as husband and wife. Why start now? I asked pleasantly. We've been husband and wife for 15 years, and you've never felt the need for privacy before. Not with Sophia from accounting. Not with the twins from that charity gala. Yes, I knew about them too. And certainly not with Veronica. Veronica flinched at the direct acknowledgement. Whatever you think you know, Richard began. I know everything. I cut him off. Including your plans for my company after my convenient disappearance. Including the fact that you've been systematically undermining my authority with our investors for months. Including your little conversation on our anniversary when you promised Veronica that once I was out of the picture, everything would be hers. The room had gone deadly quiet. Several of our business associates were looking at Richard with new eyes, reassessing the charming facade they'd accepted for years. You've made your point, Richard said, his voice tight. You've embarrassed yourself and everyone in this room with this theatrical display. Now, if you're quite finished, we can discuss separation terms like civilized people. I laughed, the sound sharp and brittle in the tense room. Separation? Oh, Richard, you misunderstand. I'm not going anywhere. After this stunt? You can't possibly think. What I think, I interrupted, rising to my feet, is that we should proceed with the reading of the will. Not the version you expected, of course. But James has prepared documentation reflecting my very much alive status and my current wishes regarding Blackwood Properties. James cleared his throat, producing a different set of documents from his briefcase. In light of Mrs. Blackwood's return, these papers reaffirm her majority ownership of Blackwood Properties as established in the original company charter. Majority ownership? Richard's face flushed dark red. That's impossible. We're equal partners. Actually, James continued, according to the company bylaws, which you signed in 2010, Eleanor's personal investment of her inheritance granted her 51% ownership. The provision was quite clear, though you may not have read the fine print as carefully as you should have. This is absurd, Richard snapped, turning to the other business associates in the room. Tom, David, you were there when we founded the company. You know this is a fabrication. Tom Harriman, our first investor, shifted uncomfortably. Actually, Richard, I do remember Eleanor putting in the initial capital. Her grandmother's estate, wasn't it? And there were those properties she brought in during the recession, David Chin added. The ones that kept us afloat when nothing was selling. Richard's expression darkened further. So this is a coup. You disappeared for weeks, let everyone think you were dead, just to orchestrate a takeover of my company. Our company, I corrected. And no, the majority ownership has always been mine. I'm simply exercising it now, rather than allowing you to continue making unilateral decisions. Such as? Richard challenged. Such as hiring unqualified staff based on your personal preferences. My gaze flicked to Veronica, who had the grace to flush. Such as undermining projects I've developed. Such as planning to sell properties I've specifically protected for community benefit. This is ridiculous. Veronica suddenly burst out. You can't just waltz back in here and act like nothing happened. You faked your own death, for God's sake. That's fraud. Is it? I asked mildly. I took a sailing trip. I experienced difficulties. I survived, against all odds, and have now returned. A miracle, really. The kind that makes one reassess what truly matters in life. No one will believe that, she hissed. They'll believe what the evidence tells them, James interjected. And the evidence shows a distress call, a storm, and now a survivor. Unusual, certainly. Criminal? That would be very difficult to prove. Richard stood abruptly. I won't sit here and be ambushed. Whatever game you're playing, Eleanor, it ends now. We'll discuss this with our attorneys present. By all means, I agreed pleasantly. In the meantime, I'll be returning to my office at Blackwood Properties. First thing tomorrow morning. Like hell you will, Richard snarled. The board won't stand for this charade. The board, I reminded him, answers to the majority shareholder, which, as we've established, is me. The room had become unbearably tense, the air electric with unspoken threats and shifting allegiances. I could see our business associates mentally recalibrating, wondering which Blackwood would emerge victorious from this unprecedented situation. This isn't over, Richard said, his voice low and dangerous. He gripped Veronica's elbow, pulling her to her feet. Come on, we're leaving. As they reached the door, I called after them. Oh, and Richard? I'd appreciate it if you'd clear your personal items from the master bedroom by tonight. After all, it is my house, purchased with my inheritance before we were married, as you might recall from our prenuptial agreement. He turned, his expression murderous. For a moment, I thought he might lose control completely. Instead, he straightened his tie, a nervous tell I recognized from countless business negotiations, and forced a cold smile. Enjoy your hollow victory, Eleanor. You've shown everyone exactly who you really are today. No, Richard, I replied, meeting his gaze steadily. I've shown them who you are. There's a difference. After they stormed out, the room remained silent for several beats. Then, slowly, the remaining attendees began to gather their things, murmuring awkward condolences and hasty excuses to leave. Only Olivia remained, her expression a complicated mix of relief, anger, and confusion. 15 years, she said when we were finally alone. 15 years, I watched him chip away at you, piece by piece. I kept waiting for you to leave him. I couldn't leave, I said quietly, not without losing everything I'd built. So, you chose this instead? Letting your own sister believe you were dead? Do you have any idea what that did to me, Ellie? The childhood nickname broke something in me, and for the first time since this began, I felt tears threatening. I couldn't tell you. It had to be real. Everyone's reactions had to be genuine. I needed to see. To see what? If we'd miss you? If we'd mourn you? Her voice cracked. God, Eleanor, of course we did. What did you think would happen? I needed to see who would reveal themselves when they thought I was gone for good, I admitted. And they did live. Everything I suspected, everything I feared, it was all confirmed the moment they thought I couldn't fight back anymore. Olivia shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. There had to be another way. Maybe, I conceded. But this was the way I chose. And now I have to see it through. As the sun began to set outside James' office windows, casting long shadows across the room, I felt the weight of what I'd set in motion settle onto my shoulders. Richard wouldn't retreat quietly. Veronica wouldn't surrender her ambitions easily. The battle I'd initiated would be brutal, possibly public, and would test every alliance I'd ever formed. But for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. The numbness that had accompanied my gradual surrender to Richard's betrayals had been burned away, replaced by a fierce determination to reclaim not just my company, but my dignity. What happens now? Olivia asked, breaking the silence. I looked out at the Boston skyline, at the buildings bearing the Blackwood name, my legacy. Now, I said, we go to war. That night, I returned to my home, not the cabin in the Berkshires, but the waterfront mansion that had been my prison and my palace for 15 years. The security guards, evidently alerted to the day's developments, betrayed only a flicker of surprise before nodding respectfully as I passed. Inside, the house was eerily silent. I moved from room to room, reacquainting myself with the space, noting small changes that had occurred during my absence. Veronica's touches were already visible, a different arrangement of flowers in the foyer, a cashmere throw I didn't recognize draped over my favorite reading chair, a bottle of unfamiliar perfume on the bathroom counter. In the master bedroom, Richard's closet door stood open, several suits missing from their usual places. He had taken me at my word, then at least partially. But his presence lingered, his cologne hanging in the air, his reading glasses still on the nightstand. He hadn't fully committed to leaving, not yet. I changed into silk pajamas and was about to settle into bed when I noticed the blinking light on my private line, the landline I maintained for family emergencies and urgent business matters. Curious, I pressed the playback button. Eleanor. Richard's voice, controlled, but with an undercurrent of rage. You've made a serious miscalculation. Did you really think I wouldn't have contingency plans of my own? Check the Harborview accounts before you get too comfortable in your triumphant return. The message ended abruptly. My blood chilled as I reached for my laptop, quickly accessing the accounts for our most significant development project, the waterfront revitalization that was to be Blackwood Properties' crowning achievement. The accounts were empty. $50 million transferred out earlier that evening to an offshore account I didn't recognize. I traced the transaction path, growing increasingly alarmed as I realized Richard had been preparing for this possibility for months, creating a complex web of shell companies and intermediary accounts. As I stared at the screen, another message appeared in my email inbox. No subject line, just an attachment, a video file. With trembling fingers, I clicked play. The footage was grainy but clear enough. Me, boarding a private plane 4 days after my supposed drowning, very much alive, and wearing the disguise I'd adopted for my weeks in hiding. The image then cut to me entering a bank in the Cayman Islands, followed by footage of me withdrawing cash from various ATMs using accounts not connected to Blackwood Properties. A text message followed. Fraud carries a minimum sentence of 5 years. How do you think your investors will react to seeing this? Sleep well, Eleanor. I sat back, my mind racing. Richard had been tracking me, gathering evidence of my deception even as I gathered evidence of his. It was a standoff, mutually assured destruction if either of us went public with what we knew. But Richard had made one critical error. He assumed I cared about my reputation more than justice. He thought the threat of exposure would send me retreating, that I'd accept some negotiated surrender rather than risk public humiliation. He didn't understand that I had already survived the worst kind of humiliation, years of it, administered in small, corrosive doses by the man who had vowed to honor me. I picked up my phone and dialed James. "He's made his move," I said when he answered. Emptied the Harborview accounts and threatened to expose my disappearance as fraud. James was silent for a moment. That complicates things.
No, y correcte.
It simplifies them. Now we know exactly what we're dealing with. And what's that? A man who would rather destroy everything than let me have what's rightfully mine. I stared out at the harbor lights, my resolve hardening. Fortunately, I've had 15 years to prepare for exactly that scenario. As I hung up, my phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. A photo appeared on my screen, a bouquet of black roses, identical to the ones I'd found on my doorstep after the memorial service. Below it, a message. "If I couldn't bury you once, I'll bury you myself." The threat was unmistakable, the sender obvious. Veronica Pierce was not content to be a spectator in the war between Richard and me. She had appointed herself a combatant, with ambitions of her own. I placed the phone on my nightstand, oddly calm despite the escalating threats. Let them come, both of them, with their schemes and their rage. I had spent 15 years being underestimated, overlooked, and betrayed. I had survived my own death. Whatever came next, I would face it standing. Morning came, with the harsh glare of reality. I stood at my bedroom window, watching the sunrise paint the harbor in shades of gold and crimson, my phone clutched in my hand. 3 missed calls from Richard, 2 from Veronica, and 1 from a number I didn't recognize. The battle lines had been drawn more quickly than I'd anticipated. If you're still with me, subscribe now and share your thoughts. Have you ever discovered someone was plotting against you?
How did you handle it?
Because trust me, what happens next is going to make your jaw hit the floor. I dressed with deliberate care. A crimson power suit I knew Richard particularly disliked. "Too aggressive for a woman of your position," he'd once commented. Stiletto heels that added 3 inches to my height, and my grandmother's emerald necklace, the one Veronica had been so eager to claim as part of my estate. My armor, my statement, my declaration of war. The Blackwood Properties headquarters occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming tower in Boston's financial district. As I stepped out of the elevator onto the executive floor, the hush that fell was immediate and absolute. Employees froze mid-conversation, coffee cups suspended halfway to lips, wide eyes tracking my progress across the marble lobby. "Good morning," I said pleasantly to Diane, the receptionist whose shocked expression suggested she was seeing a ghost. "Lovely day, isn't it?" "Mrs. Blackwood," she stammered. You're alive?" "Yes." Rumors of my death were greatly exaggerated. I smiled, enjoying the theatrical reference. "Is my husband in his office?" He hasn't arrived yet," Diane managed, her fingers hovering uncertainly over her keyboard as if she'd forgotten what to do with them. "Excellent. Then I'll have time to settle in before our discussion." I started toward my office, then paused. "Oh, and Diane, please let security know that Ms. Pierce's access privileges are revoked, effective immediately. She is no longer authorized to enter this building." I continued down the corridor, aware of hushed whispers erupting in my wake. My office, spacious, but not as grand as Richard's corner suite, appeared untouched since my disappearance. The same family photographs on the credenza, the same watercolor of the Massachusetts coastline hanging behind my desk, the same potted orchid, now sadly withered, on the side table. The only change was the thin layer of dust covering every surface, as if the room itself had been memorialized, a shrine to the departed Eleanor Blackwood. It struck me as oddly fitting, in many ways, that Eleanor had died. The woman who returned was someone else entirely, someone who would no longer smile politely at betrayal or accept crumbs of respect from a man who had vowed to honor her. I was scrolling through weeks of accumulated emails when my office door burst open without a knock. Richard stood in the doorway, his face mottled with rage, Veronica hovering anxiously behind him. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice loud enough to carry to the curious ears I knew were listening in the hallway. I looked up calmly, catching up on correspondence. It's amazing how quickly things pile up when you're presumed dead. You know perfectly well what I mean. You can't just waltz in here and start issuing orders. Especially not. He jerked his head toward Veronica. "One's concerning my staff. My company, my rules," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "And Ms. Pierce's services are no longer required at Blackwood Properties." Veronica stepped forward, her face flushed. "You can't fire me. I have a contract. A contract that Richard had no authority to offer, given that all executive hires require majority shareholder approval, which, need I remind you both, is me." I smiled thinly. "But don't worry, Veronica. You'll receive 2 weeks severance, which is more than generous considering your unique qualifications for the position." "You vindictive bitch," she hissed, dropping all pretense of professionalism. "You think this is going to solve anything? You think he's going to come crawling back to you just because you pulled the stunt?" "Veronica," Richard warned, his tone shifting from anger to caution. "This isn't helping." I studied them both, noting the subtle dynamics. Richard, despite his fury, was calculating, already considering how to navigate this new reality. Veronica, by contrast, was all raw emotion, wounded pride and thwarted ambition. "Let me be perfectly clear," I said, addressing them both. "I have no interest in rekindling anything with Richard. My only concern is this company and the projects we've invested in. Projects like Harborview, which seems to have experienced some unusual account activity last night." Richard's expression flickered, the briefest acknowledgement that I discovered his financial maneuver. "Business operations continued during your absence. Cash flow adjustments were necessary." $50 million worth of adjustments? To an offshore account? How fascinating. I turned to my computer, making a show of examining the screen. "I've already alerted our banking partners to freeze all suspicious transactions. The forensic accountants begin their audit this afternoon." This was a bluff. I hadn't yet taken any formal action, but the momentary panic that crossed Richard's face told me it had hit its mark. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "Think very carefully about what you're doing, Eleanor. About what you're risking." "I've had quite a lot of time to think recently," I replied. 6 weeks of solitude does wonders for clarity. And do you know what became absolutely clear to me? I leaned forward. That I've been allowing you to take credit for my work, benefit from my connections, and profit from my investments for 15 years. That ends today. Richard's jaw worked silently, calculations visibly running behind his eyes. Finally, he turned to Veronica. "Wait for me downstairs. I need to speak with my wife privately." Veronica hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave. "Richard." "Now, Veronica." The look that crossed her face, a mixture of hurt and rebellion, was fascinating. For a moment, I thought she might refuse. Then she gathered herself, shot me a venomous glare, and stalked out, slamming the door behind her. Richard waited until her footsteps faded before speaking. $50 million is nothing compared to what you stand to lose if you pursue this. Is that a threat? It's a reality check. He moved closer, perching on the edge of my desk, an old power move designed to establish dominance. "You want to talk about the Harborview accounts?
Fine.
Let's talk about how those accounts were funded in the first place. About certain investors who might not appreciate their contributions being scrutinized too closely." I felt a chill. The Harborview project had attracted several foreign investors whose backgrounds I'd found questionable. Richard had assured me their finances were legitimate, but I'd always harbored doubts I'd suppressed in my eagerness to secure the landmark development. "You wouldn't," I said, understanding immediately what he was implying. "If those investments are tainted, you're just as culpable as I am." "Am I?" His smile was cold. "Every meeting with those investors was conducted by you. Every wire transfer was approved by you. Your signature is on every document. Mine appears nowhere. The calculated nature of his betrayal took my breath away. For years, he'd been positioning me as the fall person, carefully ensuring that any questionable dealings would land squarely on my shoulders while he maintained plausible deniability. "You son of a bitch," I whispered. "Now she gets it." Richard stood, straightening his tie. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to announce a leave of absence. Extended trauma from your near-death experience, perhaps. You'll transfer operational control of Blackwood Properties back to me. The Harborview money returns where it belongs, and those files you're so eager to have audited remain closed. In exchange, you get to keep your reputation, your freedom, and a very generous monthly allowance." The room seemed to tilt slightly, my carefully constructed plan crumbling around me. Richard had outmaneuvered me, laying traps years in advance for a confrontation he'd always anticipated. Or had he? A memory surfaced. James, 3 years earlier, expressing concern about the Taiwanese investment group that had contributed $15 million to Harborview. "Their paperwork seems too perfect," he'd said, like it was manufactured specifically to pass surface-level scrutiny. I'd shared those concerns with Richard, who had dismissed them. "James is being paranoid. Besides, we need that capital to secure the waterfront parcels." But I hadn't been entirely convinced. And so, quietly, I'd asked James to create a secondary documentation trail, emails expressing my reservations, memos requesting additional verification, even a private investigator's preliminary report flagging potential issues. I'd sealed those documents with instructions that they be released only in the event of my actual death, a safeguard I never expected to use. "No deal," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Richard blinked, clearly unprepared for outright refusal. "You're not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years. You've built a beautiful trap, Richard, I'll give you that. But you've overlooked something critical." "And what's that?" I smiled, channeling every ounce of confidence I didn't quite feel. "I've never been the fool you took me for." His expression darkened. "This isn't a game, Eleanor." "No, it isn't. It's my life, my company, and my future, all of which you tried to steal." I stood, coming around the desk to face him directly. "I want you out of this building by the end of the day. Your personal belongings will be packed and delivered to whatever address you provide." "You can't seriously think." "The board meets tomorrow morning. I've already called an emergency session. Would you like to be present when I outline exactly how you've been embezzling from our projects? Or would you prefer to tender your resignation now?" It was another bluff, but delivered with such conviction that uncertainty flickered across Richard's face. "The board has always backed me," he said, but with less certainty than before. "The board follows the money, Richard. Always has. And right now, the money, 51% of it, says you're done." We stood toe-to-toe, the tension between us almost tangible, 15 years of resentment and calculation distilled into this single confrontation. "This isn't over," he finally said, his voice low and dangerous. "For once, we agree on something." After Richard left, I sank back into my chair, adrenaline draining and leaving me shaky. The encounter had gone both better and worse than I'd anticipated. Better because I'd stood my ground. Worse because Richard's countermoves were more dangerous than I'd calculated. I reached for my phone, dialing James. "How did it go?" he asked without preamble. "About as expected. He threatened to implicate me in financial irregularities with the Harborview investors." James' sharp intake of breath told me he understood the gravity. "The documentation we prepared may not be enough," I admitted. "We need more. We need to find out exactly what he's been doing with those accounts, where the money's really been going." "That's going to be difficult without alerting him. If he's been planning this for as long as we think, he'll have covered his tracks carefully." I thought for a moment. What about Veronica? What about her? She's been his assistant for over a year. She's had access to his calendar, his emails, maybe even his private accounts. "You think she might have evidence we could use?" "I think she's furious and feeling betrayed right now. Did you see how quickly he dismissed her when things got serious? That's not how you treat a partner." That's how you treat a disposable asset. James was silent for a moment, considering. It's risky. She has every reason to hate you right now. Yes, but she also has a wounded ego and, I suspect, a very pragmatic streak. If Richard is willing to throw her aside at the first sign of trouble, what does that tell her about her future with him? You want to turn her, James said, understanding dawning in his voice. I want to give her an opportunity to protect herself, I corrected, which might just happen to align with my interests. And if she refuses? Then we proceed with Plan B. The forensic accountants, the board meeting, the whole confrontation. That's not much of a plan, Eleanor. No, I agreed. But it's all we have right now. After hanging up, I spent the next few hours reasserting my presence at Blackwood Properties. I met with department heads, reviewed current projects, and issued a company-wide memo explaining my miraculous survival and return. The official story, a boating accident, washing ashore on a remote section of coastline, temporary amnesia followed by gradual recovery, was thin but just plausible enough to discourage too many questions. By late afternoon, the office was buzzing with whispered conversations and speculative glances. Richard had not returned after our morning confrontation, and rumors were spreading about his abrupt departure. I was reviewing the Harborview contracts, searching for any clue to Richard's financial manipulations, when my assistant knocked on the door. Mrs. Blackwood?
There's a Ms. Pierce here to see you.
She doesn't have an appointment, but she's insistent. I set down my pen, surprised. Send her in. Veronica entered like a storm front, all dark energy and barely contained fury. She'd changed since morning, trading her conservative office attire for a sleek black dress that hugged every curve. Wore clothes I recognized, not unlike my own crimson suit. 5 minutes, she said without preamble. That's all I'm asking. I gestured to the chair across from my desk.
I'm listening.
She remained standing. What's your endgame here? To humiliate Richard? To take his company? To punish him for moving on when you couldn't keep his interest? The last barb stung, but I kept my expression neutral. My endgame, as you put it, is to protect what's mine. Blackwood Properties has always been my company. Richard was just too arrogant to acknowledge it. He built that company from nothing. Is that what he told you? I laughed, the sound sharp and humorless. Richard had a real estate license and a charming smile when I met him. I had $3 million in inheritance and connections throughout Boston's old money circles. Guess which contributed more to founding Blackwood Properties? Uncertainty flickered across her face, quickly replaced by defiance. So this is about money.
Fine.
Name your price. Excuse me? To walk away. To end this vendetta and disappear again. This time for good. She leaned forward, hands braced on my desk. Richard is prepared to be generous. Is he? How interesting that he sent you to deliver this message rather than coming himself. A flicker of something doubt? Hurt. Crossed Veronica's perfect features before she composed herself. He's busy dealing with the mess you created. You mean he's busy trying to recover the $50 million he embezzled from Harborview? I watched her carefully, looking for any reaction that would confirm my suspicion that she knew about the missing funds. Her expression gave nothing away. I don't know what you're talking about.
No?
Strange, considering how close you two are. One would think he'd share everything with the woman he's promised everything to. She flinched slightly at the direct reference to the conversation I'd overheard at my memorial. What Richard and I discuss is private. Nothing is private when it concerns my company, including financial transactions that could result in criminal charges. That got her attention. Her eyes widened fractionally before she controlled her reaction. You're bluffing. There's nothing criminal about Blackwood's operations. Then you won't mind if I bring in auditors to examine our international investments, particularly those involving certain Taiwanese and Russian entities. The color drained from Veronica's face. You wouldn't dare. I've already made the calls. I lied smoothly. They begin work tomorrow. She sank into the chair I'd offered earlier, her composure finally cracking. You have no idea what you're doing, who you're dealing with. Why don't you enlighten me, Veronica? What exactly am I missing about these investments that has you so concerned? She stared at me for a long moment, calculation visible behind her eyes. I want immunity, she finally said. From what? From whatever fallout comes from this investigation you're planning. Written assurance that I won't be implicated in anything they find. I felt a surge of triumph, but kept my expression neutral. You'd have to earn that kind of protection, Veronica. It would require complete cooperation. Everything you know about Richard's financial dealings, every document you can provide, every conversation you can recall. And what makes you think I have anything useful to offer? Because Richard trusts you. Or at least, he trusted you enough to let you see pieces of his operation. Enough that you recognized real danger when I mentioned those international investors. She looked away, conflict evident in the tight line of her mouth. He's using you, Veronica. I continued softly. Just as he used me. The difference is I've had 15 years to build safeguards. What protections do you have if this all collapses? Richard wouldn't. Sacrifice you to save himself? Are you certain? Think carefully about how he's behaved today. About how quickly he dismissed you when things got serious. She was silent, her gaze fixed on some middle distance as she processed my words. I don't expect an answer right now, I said, reaching for a business card and scribbling a number on the back. This is my private line. When you're ready to talk, really talk, call me. She took the card, staring at it as if it might bite. You hate me. Why would you offer me any kind of deal? This isn't about feelings, Veronica. It's about justice. And sometimes, justice requires unlikely alliances. After she left, I released a long, shaky breath. The confrontation had confirmed my suspicions. Veronica knew something significant about Richard's financial schemes, something that frightened her. Whether she would choose to share that information remained to be seen, but I'd planted the seed of doubt. Now I just had to wait for it to grow. The remainder of the day passed in a blur of meetings and damage control. By evening, I was exhausted but more determined than ever. I gathered my things, preparing to head home when my phone chimed with a text from Olivia. News vans outside your house. Call me. I dialed immediately. What's happening? Some financial reporter got wind of your resurrection and Richard's sudden departure from the office, Olivia explained. They're speculating about a power struggle at Blackwood Properties. It's all over the business channels. I closed my eyes, fighting a wave of fatigue. Richard must have leaked it. He's trying to force a public confrontation. What do you want to do? You can stay with me tonight if you need to avoid the circus. The offer was tempting, but retreat felt too much like surrender. No, I need to face this head-on. Can you meet me at the house? I could use the moral support. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I finished gathering my things and headed for the elevator, mentally preparing for the media gauntlet awaiting me. As the door slid open on the ground floor, I nearly collided with a tall, distinguished man stepping in. Mrs. Blackwood, he said, his accent crisply British. Just the person I was hoping to find. I took a step back, studying him. Mid-50s, expensively dressed in a tailored suit that screamed old money, with keen gray eyes that assessed me with uncomfortable intensity. I'm afraid you have the advantage, I replied cautiously. You are Alexander Petrov. He extended a hand. I represent certain investors in your Harborview project who are concerned about recent developments. The name registered immediately, one of the Russian investors whose documentation had raised red flags. A cold knot formed in my stomach. This isn't the time or place for such a discussion, Mr. Petrov, I said, not taking his offered hand. If you'd like to schedule a meeting, I'm afraid this matter is rather urgent. His tone remained pleasant, but there was steel beneath the courtesy. Perhaps we could speak in your office? Just for a few minutes. Every instinct warned against being alone with this man, yet refusing outright seemed equally dangerous. I glanced around the lobby, noting the security guard at his desk and the cleaning crew working nearby. Public enough to be relatively safe. The cafe across the street? I countered. 5 minutes. Petrov smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes. As you wish. The cafe was busy with the after-work crowd, which suited my purposes perfectly. I chose a table near the center of the room, in full view of both the staff and the other patrons. Petrov ordered an espresso while I declined anything, keen to keep this meeting as brief as possible. I understand there's been some confusion regarding certain financial arrangements, he began once the server had departed. No confusion, Mr. Petrov. Just some irregularities that require investigation. Investigations can be messy, particularly when they involve international partnerships. He stirred his espresso with deliberate precision. My associates value discretion above all else. Are you threatening me? His eyebrows rose in seemingly genuine surprise. Not at all, Mrs. Blackwood. I'm simply expressing concern about potential misunderstandings that could damage a mutually beneficial relationship. What relationship would that be, exactly? Because from my perspective, $15 million was invested in Harborview under questionable circumstances, and now $50 million has vanished from those same accounts. Petrov's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted subtly.
Ah.
I see the nature of the misunderstanding. Enlighten me. He leaned forward slightly. The funds you mention were not, as you seem to believe, removed without authorization. They were reallocated according to a secondary agreement between your husband and my associates. A secondary agreement I was never made aware of, despite being the majority shareholder. An oversight, perhaps. His smile was thin. Nevertheless, the agreement exists and is quite binding. The funds will be returned, with interest, once certain conditions are met. What conditions? The successful completion of Phase 2 of the Harborview development, with specific modifications to the original plans. He reached into his jacket, producing a slim folder which he slid across the table. The details are all here. I didn't touch the folder. What kind of modifications? Nothing dramatic. Some adjustments to the commercial spaces, revised security protocols, minor alterations to the residential tower specifications. Alarm bells rang in my mind. This wasn't just about money. They wanted structural changes to the project itself. Changes that could serve purposes beyond the obvious commercial applications. Mr. Petrov, any modifications to Harborview would require regulatory approval, environmental impact assessments, and community consultations. The delays would be significant, possibly fatal to the project's timeline. My associates have considered these challenges and are prepared to facilitate the necessary permissions. The way he said the word suggested bribery rather than legitimate processes. And if I refuse? His expression remained pleasant, but his voice dropped to a register only I could hear. Then the 50 million becomes 80 million, then 100 million. Your company's stock plummets. Questions arise about your financial management. Perhaps even about the legitimacy of your miraculous return from the dead. My mouth went dry. You're working with Richard. I work with whoever advances my associates' interests, Mrs. Blackwood. At the moment, that happens to be your husband. Tomorrow? He shrugged elegantly. That depends entirely on your next move. I stared at the folder, mind racing. Accepting would make me complicit in whatever scheme Petrov and his associates were running. Refusing would potentially destroy everything I'd fought to protect. I need time to consider this, I said finally. Of course. Business decisions should never be rushed. Petrov stood, buttoning his jacket with meticulous care. You have 48 hours, Mrs. Blackwood. After that, certain irreversible steps will be taken. He left the cafe without a backward glance, leaving the folder on the table between us like a ticking bomb. I waited until he was well out of sight before picking it up, slipping it into my handbag with shaking hands. Outside, dusk had fallen, the street lamps casting pools of light on the darkening sidewalk. I spotted the news vans Olivia had mentioned, gathered at the far end of the block where they had a clear view of Blackwood Properties' main entrance. Pulling out my phone, I texted James an urgent request to meet me at Olivia's house, then slipped out through the cafe's side exit, avoiding the waiting reporters. Olivia's brownstone in Back Bay offered a temporary sanctuary from the brewing storm. My sister, James, and I gathered around her dining table, the contents of Petrov's folder spread between us like pieces of an ominous puzzle. This isn't just a real estate deal, James said, studying the architectural modifications with a frown. These alterations to the security systems, the additional sub-basement levels, the expanded server rooms, they're creating some kind of operations center. Money laundering? Olivia suggested, her expression troubled. James shook his head. This goes beyond that. Look at the communications infrastructure they want installed. The reinforced access points. This is military-grade stuff. A cold realization settled in my chest. They're using Harborview as a cover for something else. Something illegal. And Richard knew, James confirmed, tapping a document bearing my husband's signature. He's been facilitating this for months, possibly years. The question is why, Olivia said. What does Richard get out of this arrangement besides money? Because this level of risk requires more motivation than simple greed. I thought about it, piecing together fragments of conversations, odd comments Richard had made over the years about political connections, about the future being shaped by those willing to make necessary compromises. Power, I said finally. Richard has always craved influence more than wealth. These people, whoever they really are, must have offered him connections, access to circles even his money couldn't buy him entry to. That tracks with what I've heard about Alexander Petrov, James agreed, pulling out his tablet and bringing up a search page. He's officially a venture capitalist with interests throughout Eastern Europe and Asia, but there are rumors of government connections, intelligence ties. Are you saying my husband is involved with foreign intelligence operations? The idea seemed absurd, yet the evidence before us suggested exactly that. Not directly, perhaps, James cautioned, but as a useful asset? Someone with legitimate business operations who can provide cover for other activities. Absolutely. Olivia reached for my hand across the table. Ellie, this is dangerous. Much more dangerous than a cheating husband or an embezzlement scheme. These people don't play by normal rules. I'm aware, I said, thinking of Petrov's velvet-wrapped threat. The question is, what do I do with this information? Go to the authorities, Olivia urged. The FBI, Homeland Security, somebody who can protect you and shut this down. James looked skeptical. With what proof? Architectural plans that could be explained away as simple design evolution? Richard's signature on agreements that, while ethically questionable, aren't explicitly illegal? We need more. And I have 48 hours to get it, I added, before Petrov makes good on his threat to sink Blackwood Properties entirely. We sat in grim silence, the magnitude of the situation settling around us, like a shroud. This was no longer just about my marriage, my company, or even my personal vindication. Lives could be at stake if whatever Operation Petrov represented established a foothold in Boston through Harborview. My phone buzzed with an incoming text. An unknown number, but the message made my heart race. I've seen the real Harborview plans. We need to talk. Not on the phone. The boathouse at the old summer camp. Midnight. Come alone, or I don't show. Veronica. With evidence that could potentially break this wide open. I need to go, I said, showing James and Olivia the message. It's a trap, Olivia said immediately. She's working with Richard. Maybe, I conceded. But what if she's not? What if she's realized exactly how deep this goes and is looking for a way out? Then she can come to us, James argued. Not demand a midnight meeting in an isolated location. She's scared, I countered, and probably being watched. This may be the only way she feels safe making contact. Then I'm coming with you, Olivia insisted. I shook my head. The message was clear, alone or she doesn't show. I need to do this. It's too dangerous, James protested. At least let me call in some security.
No.
Any unusual movement could spook her. I have to take this chance. They continued to argue, but my mind was made up. This might be our only opportunity to gather the evidence we needed before Petrov's deadline expired. The risk was significant, but the alternative, allowing whatever scheme was underway to proceed unchallenged, was unthinkable. The old summer camp had been a Blackwood Properties acquisition 3 years earlier, a 30-acre parcel on a small lake just outside the city limits. Richard had purchased it with vague plans for a luxury resort development that had never materialized. Now it sat dormant, the cabins and main lodge slowly decaying while negotiations with various conservation groups dragged on. I remembered the boathouse clearly, a charming two-story structure with boat slips on the lower level and a small apartment above, once used by the camp's waterfront director. I'd always loved it, had even suggested preserving it in whatever development eventually took shape. As I drove through the camp's rusted gates shortly before midnight, memories surfaced of the site visit Richard and I had made when considering the purchase. It had been a rare moment of genuine connection between us, both excited by the property's potential, momentarily aligned in our vision for its future. How quickly things had changed. The gravel road leading to the lakefront was overgrown, branches scraping against my car as I navigated the final stretch. I parked behind a stand of pine trees, out of sight from the main road, and continued on foot, a flashlight guiding my path through the darkness. The boathouse appeared gradually through the trees, a silhouette against the moonlit lake. No lights burned in its windows, no sign of Veronica's presence. For a moment, I hesitated, Olivia's warning echoing in my mind. Then I straightened my shoulders and continued forward. I had come too far to turn back now. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound unnaturally loud in the nighttime quiet. "Veronica?" I called softly, sweeping my flashlight across the interior. The bottom level was empty, the boat slips vacant and covered in years of dust and cobwebs. A staircase led to the upper apartment, and I climbed it cautiously, acutely aware of each step's protest beneath my weight. The apartment was a single open room with large windows overlooking the lake. Moonlight filtered through dirty glass, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. A figure stood by the far window, silhouetted against the silvery light. "You came alone," Veronica said, not turning. "I wasn't sure you would. You said you had information about Harborview." "I do." She finally faced me, and I was struck by how different she looked from the polished, confident woman who had confronted me in my office earlier that day. Her hair was pulled back in a severe ponytail, her face bare of makeup, dark circles prominent beneath her eyes. "But first, I need your guarantee, in writing, that I'll be protected when this all comes out." "Protected from what, exactly?" She laughed, a brittle sound. "Don't play dumb, Eleanor.
You've met Petrov by now.
You know what kind of people we're dealing with. How are you involved, Veronica? What exactly have you done?" "Nothing illegal, not technically." She moved away from the window, pacing the small space like a caged animal. "I'm Richard's assistant. I schedule meetings, file paperwork, manage communications. But I've seen things, heard things. Enough to know that what's happening at Harborview isn't just a real estate development." "What is it then?" She stopped pacing, fixing me with an intense stare. "Do you really not know? Or are you testing me?" "I have suspicions," I admitted. "But I need facts, Veronica. Hard evidence." She reached into her jacket, withdrawing a flash drive. "Everything's here. Meeting recordings, document scans, financial trails. Richard records all his important conversations, leverage he calls it. I've been copying his files for months."
Why?
I asked, genuinely curious. If things were going so well between you, why collect evidence against him? Something flashed in her eyes. Pain, anger, resignation. "Insurance. Richard made a lot of promises, but I'm not a fool. Men like him don't leave their wives for their assistants unless they're forced to." She shook her head. "I never expected to use any of it. It was just protection. And now I know exactly what kind of man he is, what kind of people he's involved with." She held out the flash drive. "I want out, Eleanor. Completely out. New identity, new location, enough money to start over somewhere they can't find me." I eyed the drive, not reaching for it yet. "That's a significant ask, Veronica. How do I know what's on this is genuine? That this isn't another trap set by Richard? Because I'm risking my life just being here." Her voice cracked slightly. "You think Richard wouldn't kill me if he knew I had this? You think Petrov and his people would hesitate for a second?" The raw fear in her voice was too genuine to be feigned. I reached for the drive, but as my fingers closed around it, the sound of tires on gravel echoed from outside. Veronica's face drained of color. Did you tell anyone you were coming here? No, I whispered, pocketing the drive and moving to the window. Headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the path to the boathouse. Did you? Of course not, she hissed, panic rising in her voice. We need to get out of here. Now. There was no back exit from the apartment, only the stairs we'd both ascended. I glanced around frantically, searching for options. The window. We can climb down to the dock. Veronica was already moving, forcing the old window open with a protesting screech of wood against wood. The drop to the dock below was about 15 feet, manageable but not without risk. You first, I urged, hearing car doors slam outside. She hesitated only briefly before swinging her legs over the sill and lowering herself until she hung by her hands from the window frame. Then she let go, landing on the dock with a muffled thud and a gasp of pain. I followed quickly, my heart hammering against my ribs. As I dangled from the window, voices became audible from inside the boathouse. Male, urgent, familiar. Richard. I know they're here somewhere. The tracker shows her car nearby. I let go, dropping onto the wooden dock beside Veronica. She had one hand pressed to her ankle, her face contorted in pain. I can't run, she whispered. I think it's sprained. Lights appeared in the boathouse windows as Richard and whoever accompanied him began searching the lower level. We had minutes, perhaps seconds, before they'd climb to the apartment and spot us through the open window. The water, I decided, gesturing to a small rowboat tied to the dock. It's our only chance. I helped Veronica into the boat, wincing at each creak of the weathered wood. The oars were missing, but a single paddle lay in the bottom, enough to maneuver us away from shore if we were lucky. Untying the mooring rope, I pushed us off from the dock, using the paddle to guide us, silently into deeper water. The moon disappeared behind clouds, shrouding us in darkness as we drifted toward the center of the small lake. From the boathouse came shouts of discovery and rage. A flashlight beam swept across the water, passing over us once, twice, before fixing on our position. There, Richard's voice carried across the water. Get the other boat. Lie down, I ordered Veronica, pushing her flat against the bottom of the boat. I did the same, praying the darkness would conceal us long enough to reach the far shore. The sound of an outboard motor sputtered to life, growing louder as it approached our position. I risked raising my head just enough to see a small motorboat cutting through the water toward us, Richard at the helm, another man, Petrov, beside him. Eleanor. Richard's voice boomed across the water. This is pointless. There's nowhere to go. He was right. The lake was small, the motorboat fast. They would reach us in minutes. Give me the drive, Veronica whispered urgently. If they catch us, let me have it. I'll swallow it if I have to. The desperation in her voice convinced me. I passed her the flash drive, watching as she tucked it into her bra. The motorboat was closing fast, its spotlight sweeping closer with each pass. In moments, they would be upon us. I gripped the paddle, knowing it was useless as a weapon but unwilling to surrender without a fight. Just as the spotlight found us, illuminating our huddled forms in the rowboat, another sound cut through the night, sirens, approaching rapidly from the direction of the main road. The motorboat slowed, then stopped, hovering 50 yards from our position. I could see Richard and Petrov conferring urgently, their faces ghostly in the boat's running lights. This isn't over, Richard called across the water. Then the motorboat swung around, racing back toward the boathouse as the sirens grew louder. How? Veronica began, confusion evident in her voice. I told my sister where I was going, I admitted. And I had James alert the local police to potential trespassers at the property, just in case. Relief washed over her face, followed quickly by suspicion. You used me as bait. I took precautions, I corrected, for both our sakes. As police lights flashed through the trees surrounding the lake, I began paddling our small boat toward shore, my mind racing with the implications of what had just transpired. Richard had tried to trap us, or worse. He'd brought Petrov, a man with potentially dangerous connections. They had tracked my car, planned their ambush. This was no longer a battle for control of a company. It had become a fight for survival. The following morning dawned with a new reality. After hours of police statements and medical attention for Veronica's sprained ankle, we had retreated to a hotel suite James had secured under a false name. The flash drive's contents were now safely copied to multiple secure locations, its evidence far more damning than even I had anticipated. Surveillance equipment built into the residential units, James summarized, scrolling through the documents displayed on his laptop. Server capacity designed for massive data collection. A direct secure communication line to facilities in St. Petersburg and Beijing. This isn't just money laundering or standard corporate espionage. This is a full-scale intelligence operation. Using my company, my project as cover, I said, the betrayal still fresh and raw despite everything else that had happened. Richard's been working with them for years, Veronica added from the couch, where she sat with her elevated ankle. It started small, information about wealthy clients, access to certain political circles through your charity work. Then it escalated. And you knew about this? I couldn't keep the accusation from my voice. She met my gaze unflinchingly. Not at first. By the time I understood what was happening, I was already implicated. The meetings I'd scheduled, the documents I'd filed, all of it created a paper trail leading back to me. So you started gathering evidence as insurance, James concluded. Self-preservation, she agreed. Just like I'm doing now. I studied her. This woman who had been my rival, my husband's mistress, potentially my destruction. Now she was my unlikely ally, bound to me by shared danger and mutual need. What happens now? She asked, the question directed at both James and me. James closed his laptop. We take this to the FBI. Not local authorities. This is federal jurisdiction, possibly national security. And then what? Veronica pressed. I testify against Richard and Petrov, and then spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder? These people don't forgive betrayal. Witness protection, I suggested. The evidence you provided is certainly significant enough to warrant it. She laughed bitterly. You think a new name and a house in suburban nowhere is going to protect me from people like Petrov? They have reach, Eleanor. Global reach. She wasn't wrong. The documents on the flash drive had revealed connections to powerful figures in multiple countries, a network of influence that extended far beyond Boston's real estate market. Then what do you suggest? I asked. I disappear. Completely. New identity, new face if necessary, new continent. Enough money to stay hidden for years. She fixed me with an intense stare. You have the resources to make that happen. And in exchange? You already have it. Everything I know, everything I collected. Plus my testimony, recorded now, to be used however you need it once I'm safely gone. It was a pragmatic proposal, one that acknowledged the realities of our situation. James nodded slightly, indicating his approval of the arrangement. We can make it happen, I agreed. But first, we need to secure Blackwood Properties. If Richard still has access to company resources, he can track us, counter our moves. The board meeting, James reminded me. It's scheduled for 10 this morning. We still have time to present our case, remove Richard formally from his position. After last night? He won't show his face at that meeting, Veronica scoffed. He has to, I said, understanding dawning. If he doesn't appear, it looks like an admission of guilt. He needs to maintain the fiction that he's still in control, that nothing is wrong. It's a risk, James cautioned. Everything is a risk now, I replied. But this is our best chance to cut off his access to company resources legally and publicly. 3 hours later, I stood before the Blackwood Properties Board of Directors, outwardly composed despite the tension coiling through my body. The boardroom was full, all 12 members present, along with key executives and, surprisingly, Richard himself, seated at the far end of the table with an expression of calm confidence that sent chills down my spine. Thank you all for accommodating this emergency session. I began. As you're aware, recent events have created significant confusion regarding the leadership of Blackwood Properties. Confusion you deliberately orchestrated, Richard interjected smoothly. I think we all deserve an explanation for your theatrical return from the dead, Eleanor. Several board members nodded, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright suspicion. I had anticipated this line of attack and was prepared. My absence was indeed deliberate, I acknowledged. A necessary step to uncover financial irregularities that threaten this company's stability and reputation. Richard laughed, the sound calculated to convey disbelief. Financial irregularities? That's your justification for faking your own death? For the trauma inflicted on everyone in this room who mourned you? I apologize for the personal pain my actions may have caused, I said, addressing the room at large. But I believe the evidence I'm about to present will make clear why such extreme measures were necessary. I nodded to James, who distributed folders to each board member. What you're looking at is documentation of unauthorized financial transfers from the Harborview Development Fund. $50 million removed without proper approval and routed through a series of offshore accounts. Richard's expression didn't change, but I noticed a slight tension in his jaw. These are standard cash flow adjustments, approved under my authority as CEO. There's nothing irregular about them. The irregularity, I continued, lies in the destination of these funds and in the modifications to the Harborview project that accompanied them. I placed architectural plans on the table, copies of those Petrov had provided, along with annotations from the flash drive detailing their true purpose. These modifications were never presented to this board, never submitted for regulatory approval, and never disclosed to our investors. They represent a fundamental alteration of the project's scope and purpose, alterations that could expose Blackwood Properties to significant legal and financial liability. The board members were examining the documents, confusion and concern growing on their faces. Richard remained impassive, but his fingers drummed lightly on the table, a nervous tell I recognized from years of watching him in negotiations. These are preliminary design explorations, he said dismissively. Standard practice in any development of this scale. Nothing has been implemented without proper approvals. Then perhaps you can explain this, I said, producing a final document, a construction order dated 3 weeks earlier, authorizing the installation of specialized communications equipment in Harborview's foundation. Richard's signature was clearly visible at the bottom. The board chair, Margaret Wilson, looked up sharply. This wasn't included in the quarterly construction update we received last month. No, I agreed. It wasn't. Just as the board wasn't informed about meetings with certain international investors whose backgrounds would raise immediate red flags with any legitimate due diligence process. Richard's calm facade cracked slightly. You're spinning a conspiracy theory to distract from your own inexcusable behavior, Eleanor. The fact remains that you abandoned this company, created a false narrative about your own death, and are now attempting a hostile takeover based on cherry-picked documents taken out of context. It was a compelling counter-narrative, one that seemed to resonate with several board members. I had expected this. Richard's charisma had always been his most effective weapon in the boardroom. I understand your skepticism, I said, which is why I've invited a third party to address the board directly. On cue, the boardroom door opened, and FBI Special Agent Thomas Reynolds entered, his expression grave. Richard's face went completely still, the blood draining from his complexion. Ladies and gentlemen, Agent Reynolds began, I'm here to inform you that the FBI has opened an investigation into certain activities related to the Harborview Development Project. We have reason to believe that elements of this project have been compromised by foreign interests operating without proper disclosure or registration. The room erupted in murmurs of shock and disbelief. Margaret Wilson raised her hand for silence. Are you suggesting espionage, Agent Reynolds? Our investigation is ongoing, he replied diplomatically. What I can share is that we have substantial evidence of financial impropriety, falsification of regulatory documents, and undisclosed relationships with foreign entities that require immediate attention. All eyes turned to Richard, who had risen to his feet. This is preposterous. I've done nothing but act in the best interests of Blackwood Properties. Mr. Blackwood, Agent Reynolds said, I'm not here to make arrests today. However, I am serving notice that all documents related to the Harborview project are now subject to a federal preservation order. Nothing is to be destroyed, altered, or removed from company premises. Richard's gaze locked with mine across the boardroom table. In his eyes, I saw something I'd never witnessed before. Fear. Not anger, not calculation, but genuine fear. Margaret, he appealed to the board chair. This is clearly a vindictive attack orchestrated by my wife. I request a private session with the board to address these baseless accusations properly. Margaret Wilson studied him thoughtfully, then turned to me. Eleanor, would you and Agent Reynolds give the board a few minutes to confer? I nodded, following the FBI agent into the hallway. Once the door closed behind us, I released a shaky breath. You did well in there, Reynolds said quietly. But this is just the beginning. Your husband has powerful friends, people who won't appreciate being exposed. I'm aware of the risks, I replied. What happens now? Now we build our case. The evidence you've provided gives us a starting point, but we'll need more. Bank records, communication logs, witness testimony. He glanced at the closed boardroom door. And we'll need to move quickly before those records start disappearing. I have copies, I assured him. Multiple copies, stored securely.
Good.
You'll need to come in for a formal statement. And Ms. Pierce, she's critical to our case. She's willing to cooperate, I said carefully, with certain conditions. Reynolds nodded, understanding the implication. We can discuss witness security options, but I need to speak with her directly, as soon as possible. The boardroom door opened, and Margaret Wilson emerged, her expression solemn. We've reached a decision, she announced. Effective immediately, Richard Blackwood is suspended from all operational duties pending the outcome of the federal investigation. Eleanor, as majority shareholder, the board requests that you assume the position of acting CEO until this situation is resolved. Relief washed through me, followed immediately by a new wave of tension. Richard appeared in the doorway behind Margaret, his face a mask of controlled fury. This isn't over, he said softly. The words meant for me alone. Not by a long shot. Mr. Blackwood, Agent Reynolds intervened. I'll need you to surrender your company credentials, devices, and access cards before leaving the building. Richard's gaze never left my face as he slowly removed his company ID and placed it in Reynolds' outstretched hand. You've made a catastrophic mistake, Eleanor. One you'll live to regret. The only mistake I made, I replied evenly, was trusting you for 15 years. As security escorted Richard from the building, I returned to the boardroom to face the shocked and concerned faces of the directors. The battle for control of Blackwood Properties had been won, but the war, the real war, was just beginning. And somewhere in the shadows, Alexander Petrov and his associates were watching, calculating their next move. That evening, as I sat in my hotel suite reviewing security protocols with James and Agent Reynolds, my phone chimed with a news alert. The headline made my blood run cold. Boston developer Richard Blackwood hospitalized after apparent suicide attempt. The accompanying article was brief. Richard had been found unconscious in his hotel room, an empty bottle of sleeping pills and a half-finished tumbler of scotch beside him. He had been rushed to Massachusetts General Hospital, where he remained in critical condition. Is this real? I asked Reynolds, passing him my phone. The FBI agent studied the article, his expression grave. I'll make some calls. 20 minutes later, he confirmed what I already suspected. It's legitimate. He was found by housekeeping about an hour ago. But he hesitated. But what? The preliminary toxicology doesn't match a standard overdose pattern. And there are inconsistencies in the scene. My colleagues are treating it as suspicious. Petrov, I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. They're tying up loose ends. We don't know that for certain, Reynolds cautioned. But it's a possibility we're investigating. I need to see him, I said, rising from my chair. If he's conscious, if there's any chance he can talk. Absolutely not, Reynolds cut me off. If this was an attempted murder disguised as suicide, you could be the next target. Besides, the hospital is under guard. No visitors except immediate family. I am immediate family, I reminded him. I'm still his wife. Eleanor, be reasonable, James urged. What good could possibly come from seeing Richard now?